Well, it's a joy to be here with you this morning. You can judge for yourself whether this is thrillingly relevant or something else, but we'll see. Thanks, David. Thanks, Steve. Many others for the hospitality and generosity. So as a transfer student commuting from an hour away, I was chronically late for class. So my first distinct memory of Wheaton College was sneaking into the back of the room of Daniel Masters' OT Lit class, which thankfully had a back door. As a side note, when I was a second semester senior in a freshman level health class, the prof would lock the door 10 minutes after class started, so I was frequently in trouble and probably got a worse grade than most of the freshmen. Anyways, when I snuck inside Master's class, he was asking the class a question, and I thought I knew the answer, so I raised my hand, he called on me, and I gave my answer. By the shocked looks on everyone's faces staring back at me, I realized he was giving a test, and I had just completely humiliated myself. In that moment, I felt like everyone knew that I was a transfer and that I didn't belong at Wheaton College. So this message is hilariously and gladly dedicated to people here who may not feel like you're sure that you belong here, and it's dedicated to Dan Master. All of the muddle is still mine, though. So, yeah. I was actually hoping for a welcome that Rachel got, but whatever. That's okay. That's okay. So I'm going to move fast and stick closely to my notes. This morning I would like to address themes relevant to government, both the way we govern ourselves and the way that we govern others, namely freedom and authority. First, freedom. The question of freedom, of what freedom means, of what it means to be free and to make free, is fundamental to the modern age and to each of our lives, especially students like us in university. We all want to be free, to have freedom, perhaps even to give freedom. For the Christian, God's creation of the world is the paradigmatic event of freedom. In response to the ancient philosophical question, why is there something rather than nothing? The Christian answer is always because in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. But of course, as that great African bishop, St. Augustine, recognized, we can ask what appears to be a deeper, more radical question in response. Why did God create the world? To this, the Christian responds. Here, the questioning stops because we can't go any deeper. Here we meet the love of God. And there is no foundation under God's love other than God's love. Here we meet the most radical freedom, a present with no past, a depth that goes all the way down to the bottom. What St. Augustine called an unsearchable depth, or Immanuel Kant called the true abyss. When God created the world, God went beyond God's self and made a new beginning for others with no prior motivation or cause or explanation other than his love and freedom. And for God, love and freedom are the same thing. That's as far back as we can go. That's the beginning, our beginning. So for the Christian, the answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing, is because God created the world. And the answer to the question, why did God create the world, is because in the beginning God so loved the world that he gave and created the world out of nothing, freely. According to Christianity, then, the definition of freedom is something like this. Freedom is groundless action that begins out of love for the goodness and flourishing of others, with no prior cause or justification or reason other than itself. Groundless action that begins out of love for the goodness and flourishing of others. And the beginning of this freedom for human beings is God's own self-transcendence, the radicality of God's life to go beyond himself, to outdo himself, and give life to others that had no right or request to exist on their own. Moving quickly, authority. This leads to a deliciously radical paradox in response to another equally vexed modern question that sometimes, that each of us in our everyday lives are confronted with. Some of us hate it, some of us love it. Some of us want it for ourselves, and some of us want to knock it out of the feet of others. And that's the question, what is authority? The Christian response to the question, what is authority, is obedience to God. Whatever is obedient to God is truly authoritative. But this would seem to cancel out freedom. If authority means obedience to God, how could an authoritative, obedient life possibly be a free life? Doesn't this simply reconfirm the modern assumption that freedom and authority are enemies from the start that can't be lovers? Indeed, brothers like Cain and Abel, or Remus and Romulus, for whom murder proves foundational. Doesn't this confirm the postmodern assumption that Christianity is ultimately closed-minded or oppressive or even totalitarian? Here's where the Christian paradox comes in. For Christianity, obedience to God is practice in the most radical kind of freedom imaginable. Groundless action that begins out of love for the goodness and flourishing of others, with no prior justification or reason or cause other than itself. Groundless action that begins out of love for the goodness and flourishing of others like God. The paradox is that when we are obedient to God, precisely in that event, we discover the essence of freedom. A self-transcendent freedom set free from being arbitrariness or whim or chaos or violence, just me foisting myself upon others and the world. The paradox is that when we imitate God, we will always do something new, something free, something ultimately unexplainable and unjustifiable, but intrinsically good. Groundless action that begins out of love for real people, for neighbors, for others. This is what the Bible calls covenant and church and brotherly love. In other words, for Christianity, freedom and authority are eternal lovers. And to fall in love with one is to fall in love with the other. That is when you've fallen in love with the real thing and not an idol. I want to turn to look at James quickly, the law that gives freedom. Perhaps an example would be helpful. Suppose that it's a beloved's birthday. You give them a gift, and then suppose that they ask you, why did you give me that gift? You blow it off and you say, just open it. I think you'll really like it. So then they've opened the gift and maybe they've smiled deeply, or maybe not if it's a terrible gift. They say, so why did you give me this gift? And you have to really answer. And this, I think, could be the only reply. You've got me. I'm completely powerless to give a deeper answer. My gift was the freedom of my love for you. Or you could say with Biggie, believe me, sweetie, I got enough to be... I missed that. Believe me, sweetie, I got enough to feed the needy, no need to be greedy. That was supposed to be smoother, Matt. That was for Matt Vega. In this simple example, God's gift of creation would be like the birthday of the world, and thenceforth the gift of every person's birth. And our obedience to the authority of God's gifting freedom by loving others would be like the gift the person gave to their loved one on their birthday without being able to provide any reason for why they gave it other than love. This seems to be precisely what James had in mind when he refers to the perfect law that gives freedom, directly after having said, do not be deceived. My dear brothers and sisters, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. For James, the paradoxical idea of a law that gives freedom follows from God's own creative action, in which every good gift is given freely through God's free choice to give humanity birth in the creation of the world. For James, continuing or following in this law of freedom simply results in being happy in what you do, something that can't be explained or justified or fabricated, but rather something like an event, a fact of goodness, a gift received that is a cause for joy. Unsurprisingly then, having talked about every good and perfect gift of creation and the law that gives freedom, James immediately spells out what continuing in this way of God looks like in terms of practical ethics. To look after orphans and widows in their distress. That is, for James, pure religion looks like loving people who are surrounded from the beginning of their lives like orphans until the end of their lives like widows, by emptiness, by void, by loss, by death. It seems quite obvious that James is here providing examples of real-world problems to which Christians should respond, which should remind us of the conditions in which God created the world. Nothingness, emptiness, void, but now in a broken, dying world and revolt against God's ways. In the face of the emptiness and void, Christians should act like God and serve the powerless, which is the biblical theological basis for Catholicism's preferential option for the poor. And Philip Yancey's summary of the Beatitudes is, lucky are the unlucky. Thus, equally unsurprising, in the next chapter of his letter, James writes more urgently, speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom, because judgment without mercy will be shown to anyone who has not been merciful. Mercy triumphs over judgment. And as an example of speech and action to be judged by the law that gives freedom, James talks about how someone responds to a brother or sister who is without clothing or daily food. That is someone who is naked and powerless. This kind of creative, self-transcendent ethics is what the law that gives freedom looks like in action. This is the crux of the meaning of faith or faithfulness, or its opposite, what James calls faith without works. In light of what we've just seen above, when Paul commands the Ephesians, be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the ways of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, it would be perfectly accurate to paraphrase what the apostle says as, be free. After all, Paul is the apostle who insists it is for freedom that Christ has set you free. And where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom, and we all are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory. For Paul, when you are imitating or imaging God, you are not mindlessly parroting or aping a knockoff that is unoriginal and cheap, a mere copy mimicked by an imaginationless hack. The artists and musicians should have said amen there, but that's all right. No, you're experiencing freedom in all of its originality and radicality. To obey God, to follow God's authority, to imitate God is to discover the freedom that is the origin of the mystery of the universe and every gift of goodness whose only reason can be love. Something that cannot be caused or forced, but only freely given. This insight about the co-eval connection of freedom and authority is the subterranean stream of Paul's entire vision of love, seen in these essential passages. You were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves of one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Owe no one anything except to love one another, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments are summed up in this word: love your neighbor as yourself. As we know, Jesus was simply summarizing the teachings of Jesus, who said the whole law was fulfilled in loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus was radicalizing the teachings of Moses in Leviticus chapter 19. So here, repeated by Moses, Jesus and Paul is the Judeo-Christian paradox. Love is commanded, and obedience to this command is the essence of freedom. Indeed, this is the most radical kind of freedom, which approximates the omnipotence of God himself, such that Bonhoeffer could write from prison on August 3rd, 1944, soon before his death, only through this liberation from self, through this being for others unto death, do omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence come into being. I'm getting close to wrapping up. The postmodern world finds itself ever increasingly compacted and disfigured by two sides of a single crisis, pressing in upon it: freedom as narcissism and authority as authoritarianism. We want to be free, but we don't ultimately know how to differentiate freedom from personal preference, randomness, selfishness, violence. Think of Wrecking Ball. And thus we want authority to defend what we call law and order and human rights. But we don't ultimately know how to differentiate this from control, coercion, force, violence. Paradoxically, when we try to understand and exercise both freedom and authority, we often find ourselves left with ourselves and violence. Whether this takes the form of us doing whatever we want, freedom, or us making sure that others don't do whatever they want, authority, we end up with the same result, ourselves in violence, whether it's ideological, physical, or otherwise. And this is a lonely and saddening situation, as we all know. I believe this is the crisis. I believe that this crisis of freedom and authority is much more than an intellectual problem or philosophical puzzle. It is a pressing, personal, cultural, political, global crisis that has great ramifications in every area of life. And it is an open invitation for Christians to give articulate witness to their faith in every dimension of life, in every dimension of study, in every dimension of action. Christianity's message to postmodernity's paradoxical crisis is a more radical paradox, in my opinion. True freedom is found in obedience to God's creating and saving authority. And this obedience, this imitation, will train us in the ways of groundless action that begins out of love for the goodness and flourishing of others, with no prior justification or reason or cause other than itself. Groundless action that begins out of love for the goodness of others, especially for the orphans, the widows, and those with no clothing and no daily food, the powerless, the nobodies, the good-for-nothings of our world, left for dead on the roadside of reality. That is, it will lead us between the perilous pitfalls of both selfishness and selflessness into the ways of self-transcending, self-giving love that we see in God. I believe this is the high stakes of Christianity's prophetic message to our time. As has always been the case, Christianity is as interested to speak to the very foundations of our civilization and the global order as it is to speak to our own hearts. The ethics of the Judeo-Christian tradition is not meant primarily as a form of self-help, but as the constitution for a world in which human creatures can flourish in goodness and confront their own evil, starting with our own. Jesus called this the good news of God's kingdom. Christianity, like its Christ, has been crucified many times throughout its history. And many times, unlike Jesus, this crucifixion has not been sinless death, but rather a just, or at least understandable judgment, perhaps including today. But perhaps also like its Christ, Christianity can be resurrected, not just in the hearts of its faithful, increasingly beyond the West, but also in the moral imagination of global society, as the people of the world look for moral leadership that can illuminate and walk the tightrope of freedom and authority beyond consumerism and violence. A tightrope that for Christianity is as wide as the world itself, created by God, loved by God, and called by God to walk in the ever-original way of love. For today, such a renaissance of the biblical vision of God's freedom and authority must begin with a renewed commitment to repentance as our most basic posture in the world and with our neighbors. For we, just as much as anyone else, we Christians, have rebelled against God and failed our neighbors. We have interpreted freedom and authority selfishly as justifications for hypocritical privilege, whether to promote ourselves or to judge others, rather than serve our neighbors and give ourselves up for the world as Christ did for the life of the world. John 6:33. The position of Christians must be one of repentance and a heightened pursuit of personal and global responsibility, remembering, as James promised, whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they have heard, but doing it, they will be happy in what they do. This is the way of God. May we walk in it obediently by the power of the Spirit that gives freedom. God bless you. You're dismissed.